Hi. MiniFreak from Arturia builds on the brains of the successful MicroFreak, but adds to it digital effects, another digital oscillator and digital filter types, modulation options, 3-octave mini keys, and an increased voice count, 6 dual oscillator hybrid analog digital voices, or 12 paraphonic single oscillator voices, which you can almost call polyphonic. In this video, I'll compare it to MicroFreak, including a few things that didn't make it over, at least not for now. And then go over everything MiniFreak can do in detail. Finally, at the end, I'll play you almost all its preset patterns and sounds. Before I start, a quick disclosure: Arturia sent MiniFreak over for review. No money changed hands. They have no say over the content of this video and don't get to see it before it's published. This channel is funded mainly by viewers who subscribe to exclusive content and book updates on Patreon, YouTube Premium and ads, and price check affiliate links in the description, which help the channel regardless of the product you choose to buy. Okay, let's get to know MiniFreak by way of comparison to MicroFreak. The core synth idea is similar: multiple different synth sound engines based on different forms of synthesis like virtual analog, FM, physical modeling, and more, all passed through a single analog filter on MicroFreak and 6 analog filters, so 6 voice polyphony on MiniFreak. On the sound design front, a lot has been added, going from right to left. You've got 3 new digital effects slots. The original MicroFreak had no effects at all, and each of these effect slots can host multiple different types of effects. I think about 10 different effects types. Like I mentioned, it has 6 analog filters as opposed to just 1 in MicroFreak, which you had to use paraphonically. So MiniFreak has 6 full polyphonic voices, expandable to 12 in paraphonic mode, with a few limitations I'll talk about later, like a single oscillator per voice instead of 2, a smaller choice of synth engines, and a shared filter for each voice pair. This is opposed to MicroFreak, which has 1 analog filter and in paraphonic mode would share that filter across 4 voices. Then further to the left, new to MiniFreak, are the 2 oscillators per voice when you're in 6 oscillator mode, and the second oscillator is kind of like an Aussie filter because it's got a few digital filter types, which you can see here, digital effects types as well. There's no official mixer, but you've got volume control for each of the 2 voices, and when voice 2 is in filter or effect mode, you can feed voice 1 into voice 2, as well as run it in parallel with dry-wet mix controls for oscillator 2, in this case acting as a filter. MiniFreak also has more hands-on controls. Probably the most obvious one is the 3-octave keyboard with physical moving mini keys as opposed to touch plates on MicroFreak. The keyboard is sensitive both to velocity and to aftertouch, to pressure, though aftertouch is monophonic, so if you play multiple keys, then applying pressure to 1 key will apply to the timbre of all the keys you press. This, as opposed to MicroFreak, where you apply more pressure on a per note basis, you'll get different timbres for every note you press. Arturia hasn't totally abandoned touch controls though. Beyond the keybed, additional controls extend to 2 sliders on the left, 2 strips on the left, which can be used in one of 3 modes. So there's pitch bend, which snaps back, and the mod wheel. And then they've got 2 macros. And the third option is dedicated controls for gate and spice. Spice being randomization, not the stuff you mine on Arrakis. More on this later. MiniFreak also has substantially more touch buttons above the keybed, namely 16 steps for the sequencer as well as 4 bars for sequencer control. And in Arpeggiator mode, these give you access to different play options, octave controls, and various performance and other generative options. Clearly, Arturia also has a thing for exploding frogs in this one as well. Modulation has also dramatically improved in this one. For starters, you get 2 LFOs instead of 1, and these blinky LEDs show you their rates. There are more LFO shapes, including a custom waveshaping options where you can draw your own LFO shapes or use one of the built-in ones. The envelopes are more or less the same, except that the cycling envelope can now be polyphonic, and the LFOs, including these wonky curves, can also be used in envelope mode, so they can trigger once for every note you play if you want. Also for modulation, the mod matrix has been expanded to 7 sources instead of 5, and you've got 9 different assigns. So in MicroFreak, you only had 3 assigns using these buttons on top, 3 custom assigned destinations in the mod matrix. Here you've got 3 pages of assigns, and when you swap pages, you get a little preview of the assigns on that page. In terms of sound engines, while the second oscillator has additional filters and a cross-mod option, which I'll talk about later, there are actually 2 fewer sound engines in this one compared to MicroFreak. The MiniFreak, at least currently, doesn't have a wavetable engine, including user wavetables, and doesn't have a vocoder. I asked Arturia about this, and while there's no official commitment from them, these options are on their radar. Both freaks have a sequencer and arpeggiator. They've also both got 4 modulation lanes. MicroFreak, however, can store 2 sequences per preset, whereas you can only store 1 sequence per preset here, up to 64 steps, like on MicroFreak. In terms of connectivity, MiniFreak does have a dedicated audio input jack, as opposed to the one hidden in the headphone jack on MicroFreak. Like I mentioned, no vocoder yet, but audio can be routed in to be processed by either the digital filters, the analog filter, or the effects. Both have USB device jacks for MIDI, but not for audio. MicroFreak can be powered just by USB, while MiniFreak must be powered with the included power supply. MiniFreak has a 1/4-inch stereo headphone output, speaking of which, obviously due to the effects, MiniFreak is in stereo. MiniFreak has analog clock in, out, and reset, as opposed to just in and out on MicroFreak. MiniFreak has large 5-pin DIN MIDI in, out, and through, as opposed to TRS mini jack in and outs on MicroFreak. But MicroFreak does have dedicated CV, pitch, gate, and pressure outputs, which MiniFreak doesn't have at all. In terms of build and size, MiniFreak is heavier and has a metal enclosure as opposed to the relatively light and plastic MicroFreak. They're both just as tall and deep, and MiniFreak is almost but not quite twice as wide. In terms of workflow, there are a lot of similarities, so Shift accesses the blue labeled items on the control panel. Most of the functions are labeled except for maybe, say, Shift and Tempo to toggle the metronome, and these LEDs will tell you if something is on or off, so time divisions in this case for the effects, if an effect in the chain is on or off. There is a nice shortcut in MiniFreak, so each module will have additional parameters that don't have dedicated knobs on the panel, and you can access them by pressing Sound Edit, sort of like Shift, and pressing the button of that module. So for example, if I wanted to access more parameters for the cycling envelope, hit Shift and the Mode button over here, and you have access to cycling envelope specific parameters. Same goes for the voice modes and envelope, digital effects, and not the analog filter, but the oscillators, and even the LFOs. So this saves you a bit of menu diving in the Sound Edit menu. Finally, in terms of big differences, while it's not available as of the making of this video, Arturia has promised they'll release a full plugin version of MiniFreak called MiniFreak V. So not just a librarian or VST controller, but an actual plugin that will play on your computer and has the same controls, makes the same sounds, and is preset compatible with the hardware. So that's it for the overview in comparison to MicroFreak. Let's dive in and take a look and listen to the oscillators with a focus on what's new. Each of the oscillators now has tune and volume controls because there's 2 of them. You can control the mix and the individual tuning of each oscillator. Oscillator 1, like I mentioned earlier, has the same engines as MicroFreak, excluding the vocoder and wavetable engine, but also excluding the Chord engine, which is only available on Oscillator 2. I think that's a CPU issue. For those of you not familiar with how these engines work, you first choose the engine type using the type knob, and you see a little animation of it appear on the screen. And then you've got 3 parameters that control how the engine behaves. Now these may look identical on the screen, sort of these little lab flasks, but they do dramatically different things potentially based on the engine you choose. So for example, for 2-operator FM, you've got the ratio control, depth, and feedback. You always see the algorithm name here, and when you touch a control, you see what it actually does, as opposed to the flask animation. I'll go through these very briefly because I assume you've seen at least one MicroFreak video before this. Basic waves does what the label shows, has a few basic waveforms that you control their shape and add a sub-oscillator. Superwave is like a massive unison for different waveforms. You've got detune control and unison level. The harmonic oscillator is an additive synth engine. Content chooses harmonics, sculpting selects the waveform, and you can add chorus. Then next up is Carplus Strong. It's a physical modeling algorithm based on noise hitting a filter and delay or feedback loop. Virtual Analog is a 2-oscillator synth. So you've got control over detune. Sounds like shape takes that into sync, and timbre controls the wave shape. This is a nice way to get a 2-oscillator sound from a single oscillator, and you can pair up 2 of those. So potentially you could create a 4-note voice here. Then moving on, Waveshaper is a Buchla style wave folder. I already showed you 2-operator FM previously. You've got the ratio between the operators, mod depth, phase modulation depth, and feedback, which adds harmonics. Then formant makes 2 peaks across the frequency spectrum, which makes vowel-like sounds. And then speech has a library of synthesized sounds broken down by category, and you can choose words for each category. And then control the formants. Then moving on, modal is another physical modeling based synth. This wave controls the sort of the body of the object we're striking. Timbre is how we strike it, and decay is the decay of the sound. Next up, noise. So this can help bring different types of noise and grit into your sound. From metallic to white, to sort of like granular. You can change the frequencies of the noise. And you can add a tone to play along with it. Then the next 3 engines were added in firmware updates to MicroFreak. They're developed by Noise Engineering. Bass, saw, and harm. Yet another harmonic synth, but with a good dose of noise engineering aggression. And then the final option for Oscillator 1 is the audio input option. This doesn't play anything unless you make the filter self-oscillate. But you could, for example, use MiniFreak's MIDI, send that out to an external instrument, pass that through the digital filters, the analog filter, and the digital effects. So that's Oscillator 1. Let's lower it down just for a bit. Move on to Oscillator 2. It has the same waveforms, except like I mentioned, the Chord engine. Let's increase its level. You can choose from one of 10 or so chord types. You can invert the chords and control their character or timbre or waveform. So I guess you could look at this as sort of like a mini wavetable synth until if and when we get a proper wavetable synth on this. So speech, modal, things we've seen before. And then we've got the first new filter / cross mod option in Oscillator 2, which is, if this doesn't disappear, FM / RM, FM and ring mod. So the options here are the waveform of Oscillator 2, and then you've got FM with Oscillator 1, and that obviously depends on whatever's going on with Oscillator 1. So right now I've got FM here. Let's maybe reduce the harmonics here so it's simpler. Go back to 2, and kick up FM. So slightly more peaceful there, if that's what you want. And then you've got a ring mod option. And you can mix the two. And volume gives you level control over Oscillator 2 in this case. So those are the cross mods. Let's take a look and listen to the filters we've got in here. And for that, I've got to increase the level of Oscillator 1 feeding into the filters. You've got a few filter types. So a few low pass options with different slopes. Then some don't have resonance, high pass with resonance. And then finally bandpass and notch. Very subtle notch here, and without resonance is actually a deeper notch. You'll want to modulate cutoff on this for a phaser-like effect. Anyway, next up is the surgeon filter, which, as its name implies, makes deeper cuts. Let's maybe choose noise here. So we've got some noise here, and back to our surgeon. Resonance doesn't do anything in the low pass mode. So that's just a very sharp and dramatic cut. And then in bandpass mode, that controls the sides. As you can see, again, sharp cuts, high pass, and I think there's, notch. So again, a deep and wide cut. Next up is the comb filter. You can see this tracks the keyboard. So you've got control of vacuum cleaner mode, I guess, resonances. Now this obviously works on things other than noise. So it gives that sort of phaser, flangery character. Comb filters are cool. Next up is, if we didn't have enough phasing, the phase filter. Cleaner. With a few pole options. Again, you'll want to modulate these parameters for the best effect. And then finally, for Oscillator 2, we've got the exploding frog, the destroy effect, which is wave folder. And you don't want to fold saws. Go for maybe, FM is a classic to fold, sine wave. So wave folder, downsampler, and bit crusher. And just as a reminder, all of these filters have a dry-wet control, which you can modulate as well. So that's it for the oscillators of MiniFreak. Let's move on to the analog filter. This is very similar to the one on MicroFreak, except that there are 6 of them. It does self-oscillate, by the way. So if I reduce level totally, it self-oscillates. It doesn't track the keyboard by default, but I found that if you go to the mod matrix and you can shift down here, go to keyboard, point that to cutoff, and then set it to 50%, then it tracks the keyboard quite nicely. And you will want to set this, I think, because if you fine-tune your sound to, whatever ratio you want between the filter and the fundamental of your sound, then if you don't track the filter, as you play higher, the sound will get duller. As you play lower, it'll get brighter. So be aware of that. Anyway, it's a low pass, band pass with resonance and high pass filter. And you're seeing two peaks because I'm holding two notes, which proves we do have more than one analog filter in here. Then you've got a envelope control bipolar envelope modulation for the filter cutoff, coming from the ADSR envelope. And if you hold shift, you also get velocity control for this. So that's the filter. Let's move on to the digital effects. MiniFreak has 3 effects slots. You can turn effects on or off on a per slot basis. You can choose any effect you want for each of the slots, but you can't use an effect more than once. By default, the effects are routed to each other, so effects 1 into 2 and 2 into 3, but the reverb and delay get special privileges, which if we hit the sound edit and select shortcut, by default they are sends, meaning that they run in parallel to the effects chain, but if you want, you can choose to have them work as inserts. Now, once you choose an effect for a slot, there are a few effect configurations. So aside from the parameters, let's say that I turn this on, and we've got a reverb. So we've got 3 parameters. And yes, the reverb is quite nice. Anyway, the sub parameter, so if I hold shift and turn it, then it will change the type of reverb. This is default. Guess we can go even longer. And there's hall, echoes, room, dark room. And yeah, that's it. So let's make this a little bit shorter. This applies to all the effects. So let's just quickly sample them with this acidic sound and maybe turn off the reverb. So let's turn this on, see what we've got. Start from chorus. Remember, if I hold this, there are a few subtypes for this. Lush, dark, shaded and single, and phaser. So this does the phaser filter modulation for us with a few subtypes. Flanger, similar, and again, a few subtypes. Distortion. Gotta get a pattern going for this. So that's a taste of that. What next? Bit Crusher. This one seems similar to the exploding frog effect in Oscillator 2. And it doesn't seem like there are any types here, subtypes. Let's move on. The next effect is a 3-band EQ. Pretty straightforward. What else? Peak EQ. Oh, and a multi-compressor. You can hear the gain there in the background as well. So we'll take a taste of this. You can hear the noise in the background as it applies gain to it. There are quite a few subtypes in this effect. And going through this in detail would probably require its own video, but a very powerful effect. So that's what we've got for this slot. Remember, you can't choose an effect more than once. And we've got the delay hiding here. Can you get too much acid? Anyway, so this is without the delay. With the delay, simple stuff. There's time and feedback controls, and these can be in sync or not depending on the delay type. And there's mono and stereo options. Ping pong sync, let's go for that. Different time synced options. And then I've got the reverbs on this slot, which you already heard. Continuing our tour, let's move back this way on the bottom row and talk about modulation. You've got two envelopes, a simple ADSR envelope. There's no button like on MicroFreak to disconnect this from the VCA, and it's connected by default to the filter, like I mentioned earlier, through the envelope control. This section also has the voice modes. I'm going to ignore that. We'll get back to this later. But if you hit Sound Edit and hit this button, you'll see a bunch of options for the envelope and for the voice as well. Like I said, I promised we'll get to this, but yeah, things like attack curves, for example. You've got quick and default. Anyway, simple and straightforward. On to the cycling envelope. This too is very similar in terms of controls to MicroFreak. This is basically another attack, decay, sustain, and decay envelope. So the decay knob controls both the decay to sustain and release after the sustain. The difference here is that you have fine-tuned control over the slopes. Not in envelope mode, I guess, but definitely in looping mode. Here we go. Now this envelope won't do anything until we point it somewhere in the matrix. So let's go to, say, for the obvious, cycling envelope to filter cutoff. Just set a nice depth. So the special power of this envelope is run and loop modes. At slow rates, it's an LFO. And as you increase the rates, meaning reduce the rise and fall, it becomes an oscillator, and you have control over curves to change the character of the envelope. The curves are more relevant when the envelope runs slower. And if I hit Sound Edit and Mode, I can change a few parameters here. For example, the stage order. So now the hold comes after the envelope if you want. And the difference between run and loop, both of them will loop, but loop has a few triggers, which you determine in here. So that's the cycling envelope. Let's move on to the LFO, just so that this doesn't get too boring sound-wise. Let's go for a knot saw. Yeah, I like this pretty good. So let's modulate this. Depth. So we'll hook LFO 1 to the timbre. Here we go, to the timbre 1 parameter, and increase the amount. That should do nicely. So what have we got with the LFOs? They seem pretty simple, just two knobs. Rate control and waveform. But there are a few extra shapes beyond MicroFreak, and where things get really interesting is the LFO Waveshaper. I'll need to hold the note for this because the hardest part is holding shift and load to load up either one of 16 built-in factory patterns. And if you want, you can also create your own user shapes, up to 8 user shapes, which I think are global. And then there's a preset shape, which is what goes with the particular preset that you're on. Now to edit this shape, you hit Shift and select, which is Edit. And now each of these steps signifies one of the 16 steps in the LFO. To change or to edit a step, you hold the step and you'll see this sort of little line on top, and you can change its amplitude. It's bipolar, positive and negative. And you can also change the curve, how it leads in to the next step. And then these squiggles show you the shape of that step. So it can be ramping up, ramping down to 0, ramping up and down, or just flat, meaning connecting to the next step. If you want to change the number of steps in this pattern, you just hold last step. And I don't think this goes beyond 16, but yeah, it's anywhere from 1 to 16 steps. And if I exit edit mode and load this one just for example, so this makes a cool strumming effect. But what's interesting here, you can hear it looping, is that if I hit, remember, sound edit and select, you see additional parameters, and go into LFO1, retrig, and change it to 1, this shape becomes an envelope that just plays once. And it's polyphonic, meaning each note gets its own envelope shape. Anyway, so that's the LFO. You get 2 of these, so 2 custom shapes or 2 of anything to go anywhere. Now there's actually a third hidden LFO. If you hit Shift and Bend Wheel, that turns on the Vibrato LFO. And you can tell the difference sort of by this. Hopefully you see this on camera. This LED is a different color than these. So if I turn Vibrato off, then this changes color. Anyway, that's the Vibrato LFO. And you can edit the vibrato parameters if you go to the oscillator parameters. There's both depth and rate controls here. So those are our mod sources. Let's take a deeper look at the mod matrix. We already saw how to make connections. The connections we made so far are to 2 of the 4 destinations printed on the panel, but you can modulate almost any knob on the panel. So let's say, for example, that I wanted to modulate shape, say this, with an LFO, just to give it more life. So you choose one of the slots here. You can see they're empty. So just hold one and turn the destination. And then I need to choose what I want to modulate this destination. So let's say go for LFO2, and you can go up and down the matrix like this, but let's go for LFO2 and point that to assign 1, hit this button and choose a mod depth to get a feel for this. So now our angry shape is modulated by LFO2. Now let's say that I wanted something to control this motion. So basically something to change the depth of this node in the matrix. You can actually assign nodes as a destination. Just hit an unused assign, which is empty, and then go ahead and find that node. So LFO2 to shape 1, press the button. Now I've made this assignment. All I need to do is pick a source. So let's maybe go for the mod wheel. So again, go into the mod matrix and choose wheel and point that to assign 2 and increase the depth. Now for this to work, you can see it's not doing much here. What I need to do is actually go back into the matrix and reduce the initial level, the initial mod depth to shape to lower. So we have a starting point of, let's say, go for nothing. So we no longer hear the angry shape modulation until I increase the mod depth using the mod wheel source. So that's 2 assignments over here. And then you can also assign a few parameters that aren't on the screen. If you hold the assign button and turn this encoder, you can choose from a bunch of destinations that don't have dedicated knobs on the panel. So let's say cycling envelope amount, and you press to select. And remember what I said earlier, now that we've filled all 3 assigns, we can always open up a new page, page 2, and these are now empty for us to use for further mod destinations. Now, one more cool thing about this synth, remember I said you've got the mod wheel here, but you also have the macros page where these 2 become controls for up to 4 parameters in a patch. So for example, if I go into Shift and Assign to edit the macros, I can have this macro control, let's say, shape, but also let's go for the effect amount, which is a distortion in this case. Anyway, the reason I mentioned this now is that once you've assigned your macros, and let's go into, say, we're in page 2 here, you can actually assign a macro as a destination on the matrix. So if I hold this and wiggle this, I've got macro 2, as a destination in the mod matrix. So now I can control multiple parameters at once with any one of the sources here. Okay, let's move on to the arpeggiator and sequencer in MiniFreak. These are very similar to the ones in MicroFreak, but with a lot more hands-on controls and a few extra features. Let's start with the arpeggiator. You can hold it, obviously. And then you've got a few controls scattered here. Swing controls. And then either time division, bass speed, so relative to what the general tempo is, or in absolute numbers. Let's keep it at time divisions. And if you go into sequence/ARP mode on these touch strips, you've got gate control with the left slider and spice control, which we'll get to using the right slider. Each arpeggiator mode has a label and icon on the panel on the 16 steps. Let's get this going. You've got octave controls with the exploding frogs, up to 4 octaves, and different pattern directions, random, order, the order I played, chord mode, Brownian walk, back and forth, and then pattern is an interesting one. So what happens here, every time I play a chord, it'll generate a pattern and stick to that pattern. If I press again, it'll swap that pattern out. And these are pretty cool, and you can make them as long as you want by holding last step and choosing the number of steps. So they can go up to 64 steps if you want, or as low as, say 5 steps. So if I now press this again, I'll get a new pattern that's only 5 steps long. And by the way, if I like this pattern, then just long press on record will copy it to the sequencer. We'll get to the sequencer in a bit, but now this is part of the sequencer, not of the arpeggiator. Anyway, back to the arpeggiator. Let's maybe keep this simple for now. You've got a few performance options. Repeat. Repeats each note twice. Ratchets. I can't hear it, I think, because of the tone. Adds ratchets. These are very rapid double hits. So, that's ratchets. Random octave. We'll randomize an octave every now and then, which is really cool, I think, as opposed to just strictly playing through the pattern in different octaves. And then mutate will start to mess with the pattern, sometimes beyond recognition, and this is destructive. So that's mutate. And yeah, again, if you like it, you can commit that to the sequencer. So those are the arpeggiator features. Let's talk about spice and dice, which apply both to the arpeggiator and the sequencer. Let's get a simple pattern going. This touch strip in the gate/spice mode applies more spice to the pattern, more randomization to the pattern. You can hear a few ratchets, and maybe the rhythm changed a bit. And that's because we only rolled the dice once in this pattern. If you hold shift and dice, it rolls the dice again, and again, and again. You can see it starts messing with the notes and ratchets, and now the rhythm as well. And if I dial down spice, you can see these changes gradually go away, and the pattern returns to normal, and I can bring it back up. So that's spice and dice, another interesting way to randomize patterns in a non-destructive way, unlike mutate over here. Let's move on and talk about the sequencer. Each preset can contain one pattern up to 64 steps long. There are quite a few ways you can interact with the sequence. So if I hit play, the sequence will play back, and I can jam on top of it. Which is pretty nice. If it's not playing, then I can transpose the sequence. And it will just play as I hold the note. And if I want it to hold as I transpose notes, just hit hold. And this ensures the sequence stays in time regardless of when I hit a note to transpose it. And then finally, for a combo of both, I can get the sequencer playing, play on top of it if I want. Then when I hold Shift, I can transpose it. And now play over it again and transpose it back down. So that's how you control playing back sequences. Let's see how you sequence. You can either step sequence or play live into a pattern. To step sequence, just hit record and start playing a series of notes. If you want, you can also play a chord in and another one and hit play and it'll start playing. You can remove a step by tapping on it, and you can also hold a step and play a note or chord into it. And that's our pattern. You can set a pattern length by holding last step. And it can span across multiple pages as well, up to 64 steps. We won't do that because we'll get a lot of quiet. Let's say set it at 8 steps. You can edit the velocity and length of a note using these sliders by holding the note, and then changing the velocity, and then changing the note length. So that's one way of creating ties. If you've entered a chord, you can choose individual notes from the chord and edit them, or the entire chord this way, and change the velocity range and length of the entire chord. And if I clear this and start a new recording, you can also create ties by pressing hold and rests by holding hold rest without pressing a key. So that's our pattern now. And there are a few funky shortcuts here. So if I want to erase a pattern, just hold erase and swipe or press. And let's maybe record a new short riff. You can also copy steps by holding copy, and you can see they become blue, and then hold paste and just plonk them anywhere you want. So now we've got 2 of these. And if we make the pattern longer, let's say to 2 pages, go to page 1. So now we've got this pattern. And nothing on page 2, you can actually copy a whole page and then paste the whole page. So now we've got that going on both pages. So I think that's everything you need to know about step sequencing. Let's look at live recording. We can clear these 2 pages and go back to, let's say, just 16-step pattern. Play. There's a metronome if you want. And you can just record into the pattern. It records note lengths. There's no micro timing though, unfortunately. And I guess we don't need the metronome anymore. You can also turn on overdub. So by default, recording will erase whatever was there before. But if we turn on overdub, you can overdub on top of a sequence. And that, by the way, is something I hope they can fix in a future firmware update. These buttons work well most of the time, but you see sometimes they don't. And I think it's especially critical for the transport start-stop. Anyway, moving on. So that's sequencing of notes. Let's talk about sequencing of automation. I'll clear this out and program a pattern where automation will be more noticeable. So this is our pattern. And let's say that we wanted to automate this parameter. So you just enter mods and just start turning a knob you want after hitting record. So let's say, okay, we've got that automation, and let's maybe also automate the filter. So we've automated 2 parameters, and we could automate up to 4. And if you like, you can also step sequence these parameters. So say if I go into temper 1, you can see the modulation as I entered it live, but you can just pick a step and set a positive or negative mod depth. So you can go nuts with this. Same goes for the filter cutoff. So say if I wanted it to be more extreme. So that's automation more or less. And by default, these are set to smooth transitions, but if you want, you can go into the sound edit menu, into the sequence, and turn smoothing off if you like. You can also erase steps this way, and let's put a few back. I think copy and paste work here as well. So copy 4 and then paste. Yep. Then finally, let's erase these. Hit play. Spice and dice also work for sequences. Okay, moving on, MiniFreak has 4 voice modes. Mono, which just plays one note at a time. Polyphonic, which gives you 6 voices of polyphony and starts to steal notes when you try to play more. Then, I'll talk about para in a minute. Unison takes all 6 voices and plays them monophonically with a spread parameter that you can control over here, unison spread. And this goes from anywhere from massive detune down to something more subtle. Anyway, enough of that. Let's talk about the 12 voice paraphonic mode. And I'll increase release here because I don't have 12 fingers and I want the notes to stick around. So as I start playing notes, you can see we're getting, indeed, quite a lot of sine waves there. And stealing starts to happen when we attempt to play more than 12 notes. And these aren't just sine waves, right? So we can make them more complex. I just put them that way so we can see them on the scope. But I've got another patch here just for this. This patch is set to filter resonance at 100%. So what you're seeing here, what you're hearing here, is basically the filter resonance self-oscillating. So let's get release going. And you can see we only get 6 of these. So as soon as I start to play more than 6 notes, the previous voices start to disappear. But if I bring up the oscillators, you can see I've still got 12 voices going, but only 6 filters. So that's one limitation of the paraphonic mode. The second limitation is that you no longer get 2 oscillators per voice, you only get 1. So no matter how much I press this, I won't be able to toggle the oscillators, and the types available are just the ones available in oscillator 1, not the ones available in oscillator 2, which isn't that big of a deal type-wise, but you don't have access to the chord engine from oscillator 2 or the FM and ring mod option. Speaking of chords, there's also a chord mode, so if I hold chord, I can program in a new chord and then play that. And there's also support for scales. So by default, the keyboard scale is chromatic, but if you want, you can choose a number of scales, and these apply to the arpeggiator and sequencer too, which is cool. There's also a user scale, which opens up quite a few interesting generative options, again in combination with the arpeggiator and the sequencer. Before we head out to the pros and cons, let's go for a bit of menu diving just to make sure I didn't forget anything important. And I won't go over all of these, but yeah, the pitch menu has a really nice feature of pitch quantization. So you can modulate pitch with an LFO, an envelope. If you set pitch quantization to anything but continuous, you've got support for scales and other interesting options like octaves or fifths here. You'll hear a lot of this going on in the presets that I'll play out in the outro. So that's a taste of what can go on the preset side. And if you hit Shift Utility, we can edit some general parameters. Other functions I think are cool. You can copy and paste portions of a patch. So if you hit Shift and copy, you can choose say just the effects or just the oscillator or just the sequence. Copy that, then paste that into a patch. Same goes for erasing elements of a patch. So if you're not happy with any one particular element, you don't have to start from scratch, or you can copy a patch and work on a certain aspect of it. And in terms of presets, it comes with over 250 factory presets, most of which I'll play for you later, and you can store up to 512 on board. Okay, let's talk about pros and cons for MiniFreak. On the pros side, many of the shortcomings of MicroFreak were addressed here. The touch keyboard, if you like it, great. I prefer these keys by far. The lack of effects, proper polyphony, MiniFreak has them all. MiniFreak also expands on the pros that MicroFreak already has, which are the excellent diversity of sound engines and great sounding filter, fun and interesting generative sequencing and arpeggiator features, and something that some manufacturers miss, an excellent and easy to use user interface. Finally, a huge bonus is that buyers of this synth will get MiniFreak V, which, like I mentioned, is a standalone software synth that has the same engines and capabilities as this, of course, without the analog filters, but still should be fully compatible with the presets. So all of these make MiniFreak one of the most interesting things you can buy, certainly at this price point. And when we look at comparables, I'm hard pressed to say this has many flaws. That said, we can always aspire for more, right? So on the engines side, let's assume that at some point a wavetable synth and vocoder will make their way here so that we get feature parity more or less with the strengths of MicroFreak. Though the company hasn't promised that publicly, so don't hold me to it. That said, there are things you might find on other synths that you can't find here. For example, user engines with an open SDK like on the Korgs, and while not at this price range, sample-based synths, both for multi-samples and for granular synthesis like on Iridium or Quantum from Waldorf. Who knows, maybe we get that as future oscillators or engines, though there's no telling if the CPU can handle that. Aside from that, since this is a polyphonic synth, then you may find 3 octaves a bit limiting. Also, MiniFreak isn't multi-timbral. I think if you could create a split here for 2 presets, it would be amazing. And I would have said that the lack of physical pitch bend and mod wheels would be a con here, but the fact that you can use them both as macros and for gate and spice controls probably offsets the lack of physical wheels. And I mentioned this earlier, the one place where I think they took the touch controls a little bit too far is the play and stop button. I would have much rather had a physical button for this. Maybe it's just that this is a pre-production model, or maybe it's something they can fix in a firmware update. I'd just like play and stop to work consistently all the time, instead of the way it is now where you sometimes have to press it twice. On the firmware wishlist side, it would be nice to have a micro timing option in the sequencer. Yes, you've got swing, but I don't think that's enough. I think it would also be nice to have direct controller support for every node on the matrix. So right now, like I showed you earlier, you need to make a new assign and make a new mod matrix connection if you want, say, the mod wheel to control the mod depth of a node on the matrix. Some synths let you make that connection directly from the mod slot itself. One more wishlist item. Currently, audio and patterns totally cut off and stop when you swap presets. I know that's hard to do on monotimbral synths, but at the very least there should be a way to store multiple patterns in a single preset in case you have a verse-chorus situation, and let us swap them in sync, like on the key step. Then a final con or wishlist item. I don't know if they can do this in a firmware update, but you can't currently pan the voices. The effects are in stereo, but the voices are in mono. Some synths let you pan the voices as well. So that's it for MiniFreak. Stay tuned as I play you almost all its 250 presets and patterns. If you liked the insights in this video, there are plenty more in my ever-expanding book available to the people who support this channel on Patreon. Hit like if this was useful, ring the YouTube bell below if you want to make sure you don't miss the next one. Thanks for watching.